I've just seen it over and over again that, for example, with the stomach, it's like we get a change in a certain trauma, and not only do they feel better mentally, for example, because there's been a shift in trauma and healing around it, but they can breathe better. They feel less anxious because they're living less in a hyper vigilant, hyper aroused state. Their tensegral issue improves. Their core is recruited in a way that it's supposed to. So suddenly they feel core strength and presence in their core, which has to do with feeling personal self. And I'll talk about that in a later podcast. Their digestion improves, and their stomach is flatter. And it's like all that was just a result of getting the underlying trauma to happen. And usually people wouldn't have put all those different things together as far as being related to one single trauma. We're not talking about little adjustments this way or that. We're talking about like massive paradigm changes that just, they kind of wipe everything off the table,
Totally. I was thinking that it's almost like we need different words for like degrees of trauma. Because like trauma is like a flat landing word, at least to me.
Yeah.
That because when I hear what you say is like there's a trauma at the root of everything, and you're defining trauma. I mean, you do define trauma in that episode as a split of consciousness from some part of the psyche. So within that, there's like a huge range of traumas, and it could be anything, but it's just a defense mechanism against that trauma, right? But the defense mechanism has the same effect regardless of how, seemingly big or small the trauma was.
Yeah. The analogy I use is the circuit breaker. You have little switches that just maybe feed this one little electrical line that just feeds this one outlet, or you have power mains that shut down a whole area. The word trauma is used either whether you're shutting down one little line or whether you're shutting down a whole area of the system.
The only other thing that I wonder about for the end of the second part of Fascial is it's venturing into the subtle. You talk about infusing, like the fascial tissue, at least how I hear you talk about it, seems like the realm of the subtle. That is like the subtle energy of the body. It's a physical thing, but it seems more outwardly affected by subtle energy than other parts of the body.
Let's just say it's the main medium through which the subtle energy moves. Subtle energy moves through all the different tissues. But to make an analogy like with a house, if the electrical system is the subtle energy system, the fascia is the wiring.
Right. Yeah. I think that's what I'm hearing in what you're saying.
And a lot of people would say, well, wait a minute, I thought that like subtle energetic meridians such that acupuncture works with is the wiring. And it's like, well, there's that also, but I'm not talking about meridians at this point yet. It changes and adapts depending on the stress it's under. So on a gross physical level, when you put fascial tissue under tensional strain, the body's response to that is to beef up the fascial tissue in order to meet the tensional strain. The fascial tissue adapts to physical stresses. But then in addition, or much more thoroughly, the fascial tissue is responding to subtle energetic flow. When you take a body part and you move it in a way that fascial tissue is overwhelmed and tears, let's say, there's something happening on the subtle energetic level during that. And that you can reverse. Okay, there was an injury where the tissue got pulled too hard and then it gave way. There was tearing or the tissue, the nervous system shut off and went into a collapse. And now that tissue is just kind of not being recruited by the nervous system, and the muscles aren't firing, and the fascial tissue is just kind of left in this state that's like with silly putty. If you kind of slowly pull the silly putty apart, there's an elasticity to it, but if you pull it too hard and fast, it'll snap. Or if you pull it too far, it'll it'll have elasticity, and then at a certain point, it'll just kind of give way and lengthen out.
Right. Droop.
And droop, right? So the fascial tissue does that. I mean, like literally, it's just like that. It can snap or it can get stretched out and droop. Ligaments can do that, tendons can do that, and fascial tissue can do that. And then it's okay. What's the repair for that? Because the silly putty, it's where you put it all back into a wad and mix it up again, right? How do you do that with the connective tissue? And the modality that I do there, which is the dimension approach modality, is I see where this is happening. I see it on a gross physical level by looking at their musculoskeletal structure, but then I feel into it with subtle energetic awareness, and I can feel that the physical droop corresponds with an energetic emptiness and lack of charge. There's a deadness. But if I hold my conscious attention there and hold space, the deadness starts to change to an energetic activity. Stuff starts to move. There starts to be charge, a building of charge. And that building of charge will typically feel kind of threatening because the charge that's starting to move again, and then this is where we get into quantum mechanics and stuff. It's like the charge was in this latent state, or this, it had gone into this kind of probability field, and it wasn't collapsing into a manifest movement. But that starts to happen. It's like, here comes the charge that the splitting put a stop to. And so there's this place in the mind that's like, whoa, don't do that. We split that out for a reason. There was really threatening experience. There was really threatening energetic activity that was put a stop to. But if you can stay with it anyway and deal with that anxiety, that fear, that paranoia that starts to creep up in the mind, and hold space and stay present with the charge, which is what I'm helping the client do, and it's what I'm doing, the charge builds and builds and then starts to cohere and starts to get processed in a way that it originally didn't get processed, which is the nature of trauma, that it was an experience that overwhelmed the system and didn't get processed. So the energy starts to get processed. The charge increases, but then starts to level off and then actually starts to decrease. And if we can successfully process that charge, the tissue starts to firm up again, and energy starts to move through it again, and the nervous system starts to fire it again, and the mind starts to accept that part of the system back into the overall fold again. And you get this healing and this resolve, not only of the trauma, but you get a restoration of the functionality of the body.
It's super fascinating, like you said, that the modality is the same. That the split, regardless of where it happens, the process looks the same. So if the trauma is between, if the trauma is in fascial tissue, it's still, at least how you describe it sounds to me like how you would deal with an emotional or mental split.
Yes, it's the exact same. When I was noticing that the modalities are the same, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, etc., and I started to try to put words to and organize in my mind, what is this modality? What are the steps to it? What is it that's happening? What are the organs of experience that are being used to do this modality? And struggled to find words, out there. I found words out there, but kind of like it was spread all over and all these different, the holding is in psychology, the word holding is used, and mirroring is used, but it's kind of this abstract concept, and witnessing is used in various meditative traditions, and trying to pull these things together and really take a look directly at what is this modality that seems to apply to all these different levels. That is what the dimension approach is. My organization and wording of that modality.
Yeah, and the application of it in all those different areas.
Right. A word to use for the fascial tissue thing is that fascial tissue is very conductive tissue with regard to subtle energy. You know, the idea of there's materials that are conductive and there are materials that are insulative. Copper wiring, for example, is very conductive. The rubber coating around it is not, right?
I mean, that's a super interesting extension of the metaphor, that if it's conductive and there's something insulating it, that it's like a necessary physical barrier to it. Just speaks to like the underlying potential of it or power of it. And that, yeah.
Right. The movement of energy through the body, and then of course in the subtle field and in the mind and all that. It's where it's at, you know. I mean, it's in the same way that our society these days, with all its technology and computers, you know, and all this stuff. If you take electricity out of the picture, we're practically back in the Stone Age, you know. And so I'm just saying that this idea of electricity, which generally speaking is this movement of electrons, right? My understanding is that we don't have much of an understanding of electricity when you try to go down, you know, into the microscopic levels of it. We kind of get to movement of electrons, and we kind of don't know past there. But movement of electrons, this way or that, and what the you know, frequency and amplitude and charge and whatever. I mean, it's what it's all based on. In our psyche, in our mind, in our body, in our subtle field, it's all about energy. It's all about movement, vibration, charge, how it's moving. And in the human psyche, what's in charge of it? You know, as far as how does energy move, where does it move, how much can move, what's making the decision about that, right? What's the, you know, these circuit boards and these different governors and these different, you know, gates and these different switches, how much is it just innately programmed versus how much variability is there? And who decides the variability? And that's where you get into psychology. The human mind has massive potential ability to decide what energy gets to move, where, and how much, and when. And looking at that is what psychology is about. Why is a person letting energy move this way or that? What ways should we let energy move? You know, what's the reason someone is not letting energy move in a certain way? That's what it all comes back to.
I think that's a really good continuation of the metaphor, and pointing out that we're so unaware of something that we've evolved to the point of just running automatically. What we're doing unconsciously is done in like the motivation, it's self-preservation, right? Like it's all automatic because that's what's needed to sustain our sense of self, or that's what's needed to just keep us going. But to step outside and see that the process is a very active manipulation of energy, and that you can take a more present role in that daily activity is like the potential of all of this work, that you're not stuck with how it is, because how it is your own construction that can be undone and rewired.
Yeah, well put. Once again, you took what I spent 20 minutes trying to say and said it in like 10 sentences.
I think the only other question that I'd asked earlier and wanted to get back to, just because as we're still talking about this physical body work part of it, you talked about how like these very intense issues in the fascial tissue. So this droopy, silly putty, that bringing awareness to it can resolve it. And so what it made me wonder is, like, since fascial tissue is a physical thing and it's observable, Like, what are the means of observing fascial tissue? What's an imaging process that can see it? I've seen like physical pictures of it, but is it possible to see? But usually they're like on a cadaver. Is there a CT scan to see fascial tissue?
That's a good question. Yeah, because it doesn't show up in an X-ray, obviously, and an
Right.
MRI shows stuff, but I don't know of an imaging process that kind of pulls out the fascial tissue,
Right.
and delineates it from everything else.
It's even what's interesting to me is like it's been in every image of the human body I've ever seen, but I didn't realize what it was.
Right.
Maybe this is like maybe one day, but it would be cool to like have to try to find a way to see before and after in that process, because like the physical symptoms change dramatically and how they feel changes dramatically, and since it's around something that is physically there.
Yeah. There's a different feel to tight fascial tissue than to tight muscle tissue.
Oh, okay. Yeah, talk about that.
It's a subtle thing. No pun intended, but
I was just going to let that go.
yeah, I tried, but I couldn't quite let it go. When you feel a pull on fascial tissue, it feels kind of like that idea of tearing. It's like you can feel that, well, geez, if I did this, if I force this, you kind of feel this little micro tearing happen. It doesn't feel like the nervous system's involved, for example. In the same way that if you get a stretching on your skin, right? If your skin is stretched, like that obviously has a different feel than a muscle stretching, right? And fascial tissue will kind of feel like that. And, actually when someone's feeling a stretch on their skin, it's really the connective tissue in their skin that they're feeling a stretch on. Mostly when someone's stretching, when they're doing a yoga pose or something, they're stretching, they're feeling a pull on their fascial tissue much more than they're feeling a pull on muscle tissue. Because again, the muscle tissue thing is more of a fluid exchange process and a nervous system activity. If actin myosin filaments are staying contracted versus releasing, it's because there's of a chemical situation. The chemicals that would cause the actin myosin filament to release aren't there. Instead, you have either, let's say, waste product, for example. So then when you do a stretch and the stretch induces fluid exchange, and fluid now starts to get in there, and so then you get actin myosin filaments releasing, there's a feel to that feels quite good. When you put a pull on fascial tissue, it tends to not feel good. It feels kind of like a tearing it pulls in a way that the brain interprets as unhealthy,
You've said that before, like, don't think that you're going to stretch through it. Don't think that you're going to hammer it out. That if you're pushing through those feelings that are triggering your brain to say, ow, don't do that. Acknowledge that and don't do that.
Yeah, in general, that's true. That pulling on the fascial tissue like that is not. It's not the best way to do it, and the reason I say that is even if you succeed in stretching the fascial tissue out, you're really just forcing something that the nervous system, the energy system, and the psyche is not on board with. You may force it and then say, hey, that joint, feels looser now. I have more mobility. Look, and I didn't break anything. Like, it feels fine. I feel strong, and it stopped hurting as soon as I let off. It's like, okay, but you stretched out tissue. You didn't change the overall programming. You didn't. The nervous system just got overridden. So you actually just did a little trauma. The setting in the mind is going to go back to putting that tissue back where it was, and maybe even worse now, maybe even tighter, because now it's going to have to deal with that kind of strain that you just put it under, that it was incapable of dealing with. It ultimately is counterproductive.
So it's like PTSD at that point.
Right.
you've now stuck that part of your body in a untenable position.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, and it'll scar. The adhesions will have to form now, and the health of the overall tissue is not enhanced by it because again, you got to go back to what where's the cause. If you go to move your body a certain way and then you hit a limit, and the fascial tissue is saying that's far enough, but your sense of it is that doesn't seem right. It seems like my body, like I should be able to move further than that. And we're in this situation that's kind of a strange situation that humans are in, where we can have this awareness that, well, but that doesn't seem right, because if I just want to straighten my arm out past 90 degrees, my bicep's not letting me. And it's like, that seems like there's something wrong here. Again, on every level, we kind of have this going on where we have our understanding of how we should be able to move, how we should be able to respond, how we should be able to feel. But then there seems to be something in the way. How do we get there? If I can't straighten my arm out past 90 degrees, meaning at the elbow joint, what do we do? Do you just force it, which is kind of the prevailing wisdom with regard to stretching and all that? What it really comes back to is the mind is telling the nervous system and telling the fascial tissue and telling the subtle energy system to hold it a certain way. And so you got to get back to that, to why is the mind doing that, and get the mind to let go. Because if you don't get the mind to let go of it, again, you're just forcing something further down the line. And forcing it further down the line doesn't get the mind to say, oh, okay, now I see that I should have just let that go. I'll go ahead and let go of it now. The mind experiences that as a trauma. It was another one of the big shifts for me is early on in my career, I'm rolfing someone and I'm digging my elbow into their thigh muscle and I'm trying to get a certain layer of fascial tissue to let go. And let's say that I'm in the right place. That layer of fascial tissue is the layer of fascial tissue that ideally would do some lengthening in order to improve their overall structure and help them with the symptom that is the symptom they came in wanting help with. And I'm putting this pressure on their thigh muscle and there's resistance, not just tissue resistance, but their whole system starts to resist, right? Their muscle starts clamping up. And what I start noticing is that in their mind, they're bearing down in this contractive defensive stance in the same way that one would if you were trying to bend a joint in a way that the joint's not supposed to move. The mind would be putting up a fight, trying to prevent that from happening. And so it's like, okay, well, wait a minute. Their mind's putting up a fight against something that it seems like should happen in the same way that their mind would put up a fight against something that indeed should not happen. So then, I started backing off a little bit and looking at, well, okay, I got to get them to resist less. It's not even just, I'll go slower, try to breathe through this and try to allow this and just tolerate the pain. It's like, okay, well, that's all good stuff, but that still doesn't really quite get at the heart of it. Because the heart of it is, what are you resisting, not just on a physical level, but what are you resisting emotionally? What are you resisting mentally? It's much deeper seated than just the physical pain of it. What's the underlying trauma? What's the underlying vulnerability? What's the underlying belief system? What's the underlying orientation of selfhood in the world? It quickly goes to that level. And it quickly goes all the way to that letting go of that line of fascial tissue in their thigh that they didn't even know existed, let alone that, it was being held tight. But letting go of that fascial tissue and letting it length out a little bit poses an existential threat in their psyche. And the person's experience is, I'm going to cease to exist if I let go of that. I'm going to be, or maybe I'm going to exist, but I'm going to be forever powerless, or, the answer isn't for me to just try to put, more weight into my elbow and just like make this frickin' happen, and, no matter how much pain they're in.
Oh, right, because they already did that to themselves at some point.
Exactly.
So you're just, exacerbating the PTSD.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of like, it's a good segue to the subtle energy, but it's also just a good segue to the mental emotional work.
Yes.
That it just became apparent that both were necessary in addition to the body work. Yeah, just like you said, just you. Otherwise, you're laying down another layer of compensation if you don't incorporate those other things.
All this fascial tissue stuff it's super interesting. It's really important. There's all these paradigm changes that go along with it, and then at a certain point, you recognize, but you don't even have to do anything with that because the real issue's on a whole nother level.
Right.
In other words, the fascial tissue, it'll resolve itself if you go to this higher level and get change there.
Right.
Which is like not true of an electrical system. If the wiring gets cut, then going to the circuit breaker isn't going to do anything for you. You got to get that wire reconnected.
Right.
But with this stuff, that doesn't hold up. With regard to fascial tissue in general, it's not
Right.
true if you sever nerves, it's a different issue.
Right.
If you break a bone and the bone's sticking out your leg, that's a different issue.
Not trying to reduce everything.
Right. If lightning strikes your house in a way that it threatens the electrical system, then your electrical panel throws the switch in order to protect the system from that charge, because that charge was going to fry the system, right? That's how the mind works. It hits this overwhelm and it throws the switch in order to protect the system, whether that means a certain kind of physical overwhelm or an emotional overwhelm or a mental overwhelm. We split, and the splitting, had a surge protection effect. But the analogy, for example, with the electrical system on a building, the analogy does not hold up with regard to turning that switch back on, because in an electrical system on a building, the charge from the lightning grounds out and is gone, right? So you go to flip the switch back on, and it's fine. The charge isn't there. It's not like you go and you turn the switch back on and now you get fried, or now the house gets fried. The charge has ground out. In our psyches, you go to turn the switch back on, and that charge is right there, alive and well, even if it's 100 years later. And that's a really important thing, and it's one of the things that makes healing trauma so difficult. What happened for me was, because I was at that point for a number of years where it was like, well, there's that trauma, and that trauma is way too intense, and I try to feel into it a little bit, and I get popped right out. It's kind of like I try to help process the charge out through my system, right? I'm going to act as a medium, which is what we do when we empathize. And I'm going to plug in to that and let some of that charge dissipate through me, which again is analogous to like, I'm going to stick my external hard drive in that computer, and I'm going to take some of that stuff that's clogging up their system that their system can't handle, right? I'm going to bring some of it through me, but I just get bounced right out because I couldn't handle the charge either. It was like sticking a fork in a socket or something. I just get popped right out. And it's like, well, now what do we do? Because on a personal level, my hard drive can't handle it either. My personal ego self can't handle it either. And so I was like, well, then that's the ceiling on trying to get improvement here, which was disappointing.
Yeah.
And it was also disappointing, not only as far as, well, then I can't help this client really any further, but also, stuff that I was still dealing with in myself. It's like, well, I'm never going to get past this point because I'm aware of a trauma that I'm up against that there's no way I can process it with my personal ego self. If the personal ego mind is analogous to one's hard drive, it's like my hard drive can't do it and never will be able to do that. And so it's like, well, I guess then at that point you start learning to try to live with the limitation. As you mentioned earlier, it's like, but then a miracle happened for me. And that miracle was, it's like, even right now, I just want to start bawling just talking about it. I hit a breaking point mentally and emotionally in my life, and came undone in a way that I thought it was all over. I was going crazy. I was dying. I was something. I didn't even know what. And the result of that is that a shift happened where I got in contact with, to use the computer analogy, the cloud or the internet or Wi-Fi or whatever. It was like my hard drive got overwhelmed, but instead of just dying or going insane, I had an awakening experience. And I became aware of this level of consciousness, or this essential aspect of my being that had infinitely more capability to handle charge than my ego did. And so there were all kinds of different outcomes from that. But if we're just talking about energetic charge, from that point forward, I had access to, again, to force this computer analogy, I had access to this cloud. I could not only tolerate and process traumas in myself that I previously couldn't, but now I could do the same for my clients. Instead of just trying to plug my hard drive into their computer from my ego self, now I could show up in this transpersonal conscious presence way and stay present with and empathize with and hold space for energetic charge that my ego mind is incapable of. But back to fascia.
Right. Right. If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.